Greetings, everyone. This is a Havever from the Chronicles of Havever, and today's video is Brith Milah and the Metzitzah controversy. Now, essentially, this is the result of something I've been working on in response to a claim that was made by a missionary who, claimed to have once been part of Chabad or something like that. And now he's converted to Catholicism, which again, for me, isn't like a big deal, but he's done a number of videos where he makes false claims about things that are, Torah, also what he considers to be what he calls rabbinical Judaism. And in this video, I'm going to be basically debunking something that he mentioned concerning Brit Milah and Metzitzah. And essentially, what it is that in recent times there's been a controversy concerning what's called Metzitzah, and that is when Brit Milah is done. There's a particular part of it that in many communities was done using the mouth of the Mohel, himself. Now, essentially, when you look at early halakha, the Metzitzah is never specifically called out as being something done with the mouth, but there over time, because of certain circumstances, is that's the way it was done. Now, I'm not going to get into full details about Brit Milah in some areas because the fact that I don't want to be too graphic with this video. But essentially, what I'm going to be doing in this video is debunking the idea that this missionary brought up that Orthodox Judaism or Rabbinic Judaism or whoever he wants to call it, rest upon, Brit Milah being done with this mitzitzah being done with the mouth. And that if you basically debunk that or someone doesn't do it, somehow all of Orthodox Judaism falls apart. So I'm going to debunk that in this video. Now, the first thing is dealing with what is scientifically proven to be fact. Now, there's a reason why I'm bringing this up, and we'll go through a number of sources concerning how, according to Chazal, according to the rabbis of, previous generations, the leaders of the Jewish communities in different generations, what did they say concerning something that's, a scientific fact, whether it's a medical fact, and how we relate to those things, for example. Now, one of the first things we can look at is Otzer Goanim, which is basically a collection of different writings the Goanim wrote about halakha, specifically from the Talmud. And when we look at the Gaon named Shivrira Gaon, he actually talks about an issue concerning, the idea that there are things that are claimed by rabbis of previous generations in the Talmud and, after, that essentially are not, Jewish law. They're not a mitzvah. And that essentially those words, for example, that deal with, let's say, science or medicine or medical, practices and things like that, are not things that are derived from, something that, can be considered a mitzvah. And that those words from those rabbis who, for with the most part, if you think about it, were using the science of their day, we don't have to simply hold by those things because they said it, and during those times, it's easily a situation where there could have been things that they had no access to or no knowledge of, or the ability not to know. Now, the Rambam deals with this issue also when he deals with something that he mentions in a writing that he did called the Shmone Perakim. And essentially what he talks about when he, basically goes over the things that are mentioned in the beginning of it, because what I'm showing here comes near the end, where he says that, everything that, is mentioned is not something that he invented or created for himself. It's not something that he just made up, for example. And he says, Elahim in inyanim, melukotim, medivrei hachamim b'midrashot, uvatalmud, v'zulato hachiborahem, גם דברי הפילוסופים הראשונים ומחברי הרבה מבני אדם, וקבל האמת ממי שאמרו. So essentially what he says is that what he mentions previously in the text are things that are derived from, the different, like, sages, the rabbis, of Israel, the leaders of the Israeli people, various midrashims, the Talmud, and different writings. And then he also says even from the original, the first philosophers that, essentially you can look at like in different parts of the world, including like Greek, people, Greeks who dealt with knowledge, wisdom and medicine and things like that. And he says that, we accept the truth from wherever it comes. So this is an important point that the Rambam mentions that when it comes to something that's the truth, "Wekibel haemet mimi she'omoru," it doesn't have to be something that a Jew says something in order for it to be true. That if it's something dealing with like the Torah, that's where we hold upon that only Jews who keep the Torah are the source for that. But when it comes to things like medicine, technology, science, we can rely on any source that proves out what the truth is. Now, continuing with the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam also deals with the idea that, for example, there was information that, rabbis of old use, in terms of like, let's say medicine or anything that deals with like science, that they got from, different nations that were around them. And that there are situations where the nations that were around the Jewish people, had ideas of science and technology or medicine that, if you will, win or are correct versus like some of the ideas that various Jews had about them. So it's not a problem to say that the rabbis of a certain generation mentioned something about medicine and were incorrect. where the nations may have had it correct. And he mentions here where he says, "Wazeh nachon, ki mi shedan be'inyanim ha'yunim, oseh zot rak lefi ma she'ayon havi alav, ולכן מאמינים במה שהוכחו לו התאמתו." So essentially what he says is that, it makes sense that, if the nations, have something about science or medicine that's correct, we go by what they say. And he says that, when it comes to those kind of matters, we go by and believe in what is proven to be true. So what things, have hochochot, which is like proof, or something that proves itself to be true, and hit amata, something that, basically makes itself, the truth, if you will. So these are the things that the Rambam explains that we go by. And he continues in the Moreh Nevuchim, in this particular aspect of thinking, he says, Ki ha-chokhmot ha-limaduyot hayu b'zamanim hahem chasurot v'lo dibaru bahem ala derech kabbalah min ha-nevi'im aval me'asher hahem chokhma hadorot hahem b'inyanim hahem o me'asher shema'om me'chokhme hadorot hahem. So what he mentions here is concerning the, different leaders of the Jewish communities who, for example, let's say use things that were the science of their day, or for example, the technology of their day, or the understanding of medicine of the day. And he says that, they didn't claim to get that from a Navi, from a prophet, so essentially it's, the knowledge of their generation. And it's understandable that there are some situations where they had a lacking of knowledge of their generation. So it's almost like saying, at a certain point, even, in Europe, for example, there were people who were against the idea of like, in the medical practice of washing their hands or, disinfecting their hands because it just wasn't the common knowledge of the time. And basically the guy who presented it as something to do, initially, if you will, got laughed out of, with like the laughing stock, but now we know that he was correct. And those previous generations, they were using the knowledge of their time, but the knowledge was insufficient. And the same thing can exist when it comes to medicine, technology, and things like that. But the Torah, of course, is the place where the Jewish people who hold by Torah, that's where our knowledge base is. But, we can learn from the nations and also understand and accept that in previous generations, there were situations where rabbis made medical estimations in the Talmud and even after, and that we can understand and say, okay, well, there's some situations when it comes to medicine or science that they were wrong about because they used what was available at their time. So then the Rambam, explains, for example, in his letter to the rabbis of France, when dealing with, I think they was dealing with the issue of astronomy and astrology, that he basically says that, when it comes to things that we accept, that there's things that, that come directly from the Nevi'im, but there are things that, we potentially, don't come from the Nevi'im, and that we have to be able to be available and say that the ideas I have, the things that I believe in, they come from about three different ways that they can come down to me. That there's some things that manti bo bifnei Kabbalah. So there's things I believe in because I've received them from, let's say, previous generations or people that consider to be knowledgeable. He says, "V'zeh hamanti bo bifnei ha'hargasha." So there are things that I, for example, believe in because of the fact that, I can like physically contact them, touch them, and things like that, and research them. So, I can use my senses to be able to, try to figure out what the truth about them is. And there are some things that, for example, come from de'ah. So, "Zo hamanti bo bifnei hade'ah." So this would be like from firsthand knowledge. So essentially what the Rambam's trying to say that a person should be aware of where they get their understandings from and where they get the things that they believe in from. And that can only be a part of three things. And if a person doesn't align with those three different methodologies, it's like they're one of the people who would believe in anything. And that's what he says here. Patiya amin lechol davar, which is from the book of Mishle. So essentially what the Rambam's explaining is that, a person has to be able to be aware of where their knowledge base comes from when it comes to understanding. And then another thing that the Rama mentions, lastly, concerning this issue, is that, one of the things he explains is that, there are some situations where from previous generations of rabbis, that things about medicine or about, technology or about science was hidden from them. And that there are some situations where, for example, they weren't fully saying that they believed in something. It's just that was what was available for that generation. And that there are some situations where they were using, the information they had as like a remez, as he says. And he says something very important where he says, "Wele'olam al yishlich al adam da'ato acharav ki ha'anaim hem lefanim lo lachor." So essentially what it says is a person should never do away with their reason because, your eyes were created, were in the front and not in the rear. So, we don't go and try to say, for example, let's say because a rabbi 1,000 or 2,000 years ago wrote something about medicine that we have to accept it because he wrote it. Those things are not something that are considered to be halakha. If it's something that's proven to medically not be something we do. And that's going to come into play when we talk about this issue of Metzitzah, because that's specifically the thing that the missionary, if you will, either doesn't know or it's something that, for example, he was trying to avoid to make a bigger point of trying to find some way to say that the oral Torah and even Jews of today don't know what we're talking about. So concerning this issue of Metzitzah, and does the halakha state that a mouth is used? So again, all this is talking about is the issue that, there's an idea that is mentioned, that, for example, when, you do a brit milah, a part of it is Metzitzah, and that it's done with the mouth. But we'll look in just a second to see if that's actually what the case. So in the Talmud Bavli Mishnah, in the Mishnah part of the Talmud, concerning Shabbat, Masechet Shabbat 133a, it deals with the issue of doing a Brit Milah on Shabbat, and it talks about like how it's done, and then it mentions a Metzitzin, which is a part of it, which the word translates into like either sucking something out or squeezing something out, in terms of like dealing with the blood when a person actually does the Brit Milah. So later in the Gemara, it actually explains that this is done because of a medical issue, meaning that at the time they believed that Motzitzin was important because of, a medical issue. And I'll explain what that means in just a bit. So when the Rambam explains about like how actually Brit Milah is done, and he explains it Katzat Moholin. So when he deals with the part about the Motzitzin, he says, Wa'achar kach, and this is after you do the Brit Milah itself. He says, after that, that's when he says Motzet Hamilah. So you like basically squeeze a little bit of blood from the area, of when part of it. He says, Ad sheyetzeh hadam mimokomot rachokim. So he says, like you do that until like there's a bit of blood that comes from like the further away parts. And he says, Kadeh shelo yavo lidei sakana. So he explains that this is done because of the fact of like the danger, so meaning the danger to the child. And we'll see in just a second why it's believed in these sources that there was a danger to the child. And it's because of, in short, the science of their day said that that was the case and not something that specifically was from the halakha. And the same thing is actually mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch. So we see that, the basic three sources that most Jews use in terms of halakha, like overall halakha, the Talmud, the Mishnah Torah, Shulchan Aruch, talk about this issue and specifically mention that there's an issue of a medical concern in terms of like, doing a mitzitzah. Motzitzin, for a milah is done because they had an idea that it was because of a medical need. So this appears to be the source of where this understanding came from. It's from the Hippocratic Corpus, which is considered to be father of Western medicine, 460 BCE to 370 BC. And what it states is the following: all wounds draw their inflammation and swelling from the surrounding parts because of the blood flowing into them. In every recent wound, it is expedient to cause blood to flow from it abundantly, for thus will the wound and the adjacent parts be less attacked with inflammation. When the blood flows, they become drier and less in size as being thus dried up. Indeed, what prevents the healing is the decay of the blood. So as we see, this is something that, at one point, it was considered medical science. This is something from like Greek medical science, which at the time would have been like, the wise ones of medicine, and science. And we know nowadays that this is actually not the case. But a couple thousand years ago, this was considered to be the way things worked. And even in Europe, there was situations where they did this kind of thing in Europe too, because it was understood to be the medical practice of the time. And the situation is very clear. The mitzitzah, part of the Brit Milah, is something that, for example, if we find that it was being done because of like this medical issue, of the belief in this medical issue, we can understand why they did it during their generation. But if we find that it's not correct, then it's something that we don't have to do for this reason, especially when the sources we saw earlier mentioned nothing about using the mouth to do mitzitzin. Mitzitzin just means to either suck or to draw blood from, draw something from somewhere, to either, draw the blood out, suck it out, or even to push it out. But it doesn't specifically say that it has to be done with the mouth. So in the modern day, there's been pushback, for the least the last about 200 years or so, where there are some rabbis, where they see the Chotam Sofer, who actually mentioned that there were issues back in their time with, mutzitzin being done with the mouth, and that there were situations where they were saying, no, it shouldn't be done with the mouth. And there's other means that, when the blood is drawn, and that there are some communities that didn't even do mitzitzin at all because of this issue. So we understand now that this tells us very clearly that they knew about some of the issues way back then. And it's just a matter of there's some communities that will accept a rabbi saying, no, we shouldn't be doing this because of these issues. And there's some communities that say, no, no, I'm going to do it. And it's only in the time of the Achronim that they specifically talk as if, some of them talk as if it's a requirement. But we see even going to the 1700s to 1839 that there were essentially, issues that the Chotam Sofer during his lifetime was dealing with. And I believe this is from like, maybe like the 1800s or so. And the same thing, we have another source that deals with this issue coming from around the same period of the late 1800s, early 1900s, where, there were rabbis who addressed this issue, that it's something that, shouldn't be done, especially since the idea of the Talmud was that it was done because of like something that was considered to be a medical issue. But now that we see evidence, that this is not the case anymore, this is where, we can see that there's a change in how these things are perceived. So then let's do with what exactly is the halakha? Does the halakha about doing a brit milah specifically itself, from the Torah itself, require motzitzin? So the Rambam explains the following. He says, Mila mitzvat aseh, shechayavim aleha karet, shene'amar wa'arel zachar, asher lo yimol at basar olathom, v'nichrotho hanefesh hahim. ומצווה על האוב למול את בנו, ועל הרוב למול את כל עבודו, יוליד בית ומכנף כסף. So essentially what the Rambam explains is that the Brit Milah itself is, just something very general, is that it is addressed here. And he specifically talks about how it's the responsibility of the father to do it, meaning that at some point there were most, number, if not most Jewish fathers would have been the one doing the Brit Milah to their, to their sons, and essentially they're the ones responsible for it. And even if a father doesn't have the ability to do it himself, he has to be the one responsible for who's going to do it. So what that tells us is something very clear. If there's a situation where there is any, the issue of how to do a Brit Milah, the father is the one who's supposed to be 100% knowledgeable about what's supposed to happen. And if there are any issues or questions or whatever, he has to be the one to take responsibility for those issues. Now, the thing is very clear that a father should also be aware that, okay, well, first of all, when we look at Metzitzah, the Talmud was very clear that it was done at one point because of, the idea that it was a medical issue that they were trying to prevent danger to the child. But let's say that it's found that the procedure is dangerous in itself, or the way it's being done popularly is dangerous, then we have the ability to look at that and say, okay, well, Metzitzah, the way, is there a safer way, those of us who know medicine, for example, to do this in a different way? And is it even a requirement based on the halakha, the way it's described? And these are the things that, every, father would have to grapple with and deal with. And the basic issue is that you can do a brit milah in a sense without the Metzitzah, but if you're going to do Metzitzah, there's a way to do it without it being a danger to the child. And it's not like some foundation, for example, the Metzitzah, that the, like if you will, Torath Mosheh or Orthodox Judaism rest upon. And if you take that away, then all of a sudden, everything falls apart, especially with a mitzvah like this, that most of the people in the world are not going to even see this mitzvah. It's not like when I put a kippah on or wear tzitziot or wear tefillin or when I read from a Sefer Torah that people can see that. Well, this is something when you do with the Brit Milah that really only the individual, the man who had a Brit Milah, his father during the time of the Brit Milah, potentially his mother too, and then his wife, and then whoever he buries him. That's pretty much it. This is not one of these things that gets flashed out there in front of the world. So the basic issue is that at one point the belief was under, the current medicine of the day that there was a danger that was being prevented by doing Metzitzah. But once it's found that, for example, the issues about how it's done and things like that, the halakha never says you have to do it with your mouth. The halakha, even addresses these issues that, whenever there's an issue of danger, we, push away the danger in order to do the right thing. And that's one of the reasons that if the child is sick and a brit milah would put them in danger, you put it off until the point where the child's no longer in medical danger. So in conclusion, we can easily see that the missionary who mentioned this is really like, I would say like, is really not on the straight and narrow, if you will. And this is something that when he brought it up in the video, there is because someone, there was someone who called in who's like, actually Jewish and follows Torah and halakha, who was challenging him on something, and then he was like asked this question, and when the person said, "No, I don't want to do Motzitzin, especially not the way you're describing it," he didn't want to hear anymore and clicked them off. And again, it's his show. This missionary can choose to do that. But that's why I say that, as Jews, we want to make sure that those of us who hold by Torah know the actual truth. And again, the missionary, his audience are usually people who don't know Hebrew and people who aren't even Jewish to begin with. And that's, his lane, if you will. And that's why I say that, we as Jews have to know and be able to say what the Torah and the halakha actually states. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you for listening. Take care and bye.